Now, the Falcons probably aren't making a big splash when free agency kicks off next week, but if there's one position that's worth them going cannonball, it would be cornerback.
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of the Locked On Falcons podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, now the #1 sports podcast network in the Western Hemisphere. And today's episode is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code Locked On for $20 off your first purchase. Now, if you don't know me, I'm your humble host, Aaron Freeman, aka Sirius Black. Been covering the Atlanta Falcons for 2 decades, formerly at falcfans.com. RIP, still going strong here on Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. And on today's daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, we are continuing our free agent positional breakdowns. And today we are breaking down the various cornerback options potentially that could upgrade both the outside cornerback spot opposite AJ Terrell, as well as the nickel cornerback spot previously manned by Dee Alford and Billy Bowman. But before we get to all the various free agent options that the Falcons could potentially sign this offseason, we need to explore why and explain why and emphasize why cornerback is such a need, why it's so worthwhile for the Falcons to invest at this position. Because essentially, as I said at the top, this is probably the one position that I would argue that it makes sense for the Falcons to shop at the top of the market when it comes to the cornerback position, right? And a main reason for why I think the Falcons should be aggressive in free agency when it comes to the cornerback position is it's just hard to hit on an outside corner, a starting caliber outside corner as a rookie, after round 2, right? It can be done, but usually when you go back and you look at recent draft classes, it's like one good outside corner that comes in and starts and performs well, that's drafted in rounds 3 through 5 in any given draft in recent year. But there's 15 corners drafted during that stretch of rounds, right? So it's like a 1 in 15 shot of you landing the Tariq Woolen or whoever is that guy that is the impact starter right away outside of round 2. And so if the Falcons don't address the cornerback position in free agency, they're going to be almost forced to pull that trigger very early in the draft. And there's no guarantee that the draft, as we know, the draft being a crapshoot, is going to break the way that you want, where you won't be reaching on a corner or something like that. And if you decide, okay, well, we don't want to reach on a 3rd round talent in the 2nd round or a 4th round talent in the 3rd round, then you might wind up punting at CB2 for the 6th year in a row. And that to me is why it should be a priority in March. You've been trying to make do for the last 5 years across from AJ Terrell. You haven't really made any significant investments under the previous regime, and I hope the new regime under Ian Cunningham and Kevin Stefanski will make that significant investment starting now, right? The cornerback 2 was a major problem for this team last year. We talked about it on this podcast, starting with that 49ers loss in week 7, where basically every opposing offense's game plan was basically just target the guy that is opposite AJ Terrell. It's like, okay, pre-snap, go up to the line of scrimmage. What side of the field is AJ Terrell on? Okay, throw it to the opposite side of the field. And that was a very effective game plan for opposing offenses, not just starting in week 7, but throughout the season. And it just really became so apparent starting in week 7 that was clearly what teams were doing. And, the fact is that the Falcons, it could have been a lot worse, right? Because the Falcons had such injury luck when it came to opposing number 1 and number 2 wide receivers not playing against the Falcons, right? Jordan Addison, Terry McLaurin, Brandon Ayuk, Tyreek Hill, Devontae Adams, just to name a few guys that did not play against the Atlanta Falcons that would have absolutely annihilated our CB2 if they, were given the privilege to line up against Mike Hughes and company last season. And so I don't know if this means that, hey, if they're going to invest at this position in free agency, that means you got to go out there and sign a massive multi-year contract. I think you can probably get by with a 1-year stopgap. For example, like Marshon Lattimore, he's potentially going to be a cap cut by the Commanders, right? And he's got age and injury concerns that probably means that you're probably going to sign him to like a 1-year deal, right? But we know Marshon Lattimore has made a name throughout his career as a guy that can get physical with bigger wideouts, which has been a problem for your team because AJ Terrell does not deal well with the big physical wide receivers. And finding that number 2 guy that can handle those guys makes a ton of sense. And you look at a guy like Marshon Lattimore with his age and injury history. It's like, okay, he'll probably miss half the season, but for the 9 games that he does play, as long as those 9 games happen to be the games that we face DK Metcalf, Mike Evans, Tedero McMillan, T. Higgins, etc., then we're going to be fine, right? But, whether it's Marshon Lattimore or anybody else, the goal for me is I want to walk away from this offseason feeling like the Falcons have a good and certainly better plan than what they've had in recent years at the cornerback position. I want to feel like there's a vision with that position. You go back to the Jeff Okudah trade back in 2023. I thought that was a good bet. I thought it was a worthwhile bet, a low risk, high reward type bet. It didn't work out, but after that, the Falcons just kind of stopped trying, right? They went back to the low percentage bets, the Mike Hughes, the Clark Phillips, right? And to me, there was vision behind the Jeff Okudah trade. But then everything else after that and many of the things before that, to me, lacked that vision under Terry Fontenot. It just smacked of complacency or low effort plans at that cornerback position. And I'm hoping that we get vision in a plan from Ian Cunningham that is better. But we'll see if we get that, right? Because obviously, as someone who has had to watch this revolving door at the CB2 spot for 5+ years now, I'm carrying a lot of baggage into this offseason. Baggage that Ian Cunningham and company won't necessarily be carrying because they're new here and they don't necessarily are not as up to date on, the various incarnations of CB2 that the Falcons have had over the years, right? But it is warming to me, heartwarming, I guess you could say, that you go back to Ian Cunningham alongside Bowles' first offseason in Chicago. Guess what their number 1 pick was? It was 2nd-round cornerback Kyler Gordon. Right? I know Jeff Ulbrich appreciates the value of having 2 lockdown corners because, in my humble opinion, a big part of the reason why that Jets defense, at least according to EPA, was the best defense in the NFL from 2022 to 2023, was because they could lock down opposing teams. They could man up pretty much any group of receivers with DJ Reed and Sauce Gardner and Michael Carter, right? And so I know to a certain extent I'm preaching to the choir for my audience, right? Because I did a Lockdown Falcons community poll back at the beginning of February, asking people what they thought the biggest defensive need, and 54% of the majority said corner. 34% said D tackle. But then a couple of days later, I asked, how do you think the Falcons should address the cornerback need? And 57% of you said via the draft, and only 32% of you said making a splash in free agency. So to me, in an ideal world, they'll double dip. They'll do both. They'll get an immediate answer that we can sit here and say, okay, that's our week 1 starter, in free agency, and then hopefully find a long-term answer in the draft, whether that's a guy that is going to be a plug-and-play starter, whether that's a guy that's more of a project that may be a little bit long-term developmental, whatever the case may be. But I would like to see, a Terry Fontenot strategy where it's just like you double dip at the cornerback position, like Terry Fontenot has done so much at other positions. I would love to see that strategy applied to the cornerback position this offseason. And so that we can sit here and go like, okay, Ian, you did it. We don't have to worry about this anymore. This has been a problem area for half a decade, and it's not going to be a problem area for the next half decade or more. So we'll see, right? We got to get some size in here. We're tired of all these shrimps in this cornerback room. So we'll talk about some of the guys that can bring some of that size, as well as some of the guys at the top of the market that could be on the Falcons' radar if Ian Cunningham and company agree with me that this is a worthwhile endeavor to make a splash in free agency. And we'll break that down as we continue today's Locked On Falcons. So we live in a world where you can stream anything, order food in minutes, and we carry supercomputers in our pockets. But somehow, buying tickets to a live game still feels complicated, whether it's hidden fees, jumping prices, or endless steps. There has to be a better way, and now there is with Game Time. That's why I use Game Time. It gives the advantage back to the fans and makes getting tickets simple. Whether we're talking NFL games, concerts, music, theater, comedy, whatever you're into, you can just jump on the act, check out tickets for any upcoming game, NBA games and whatnot for the Hawks, and it takes just minutes. You get the panoramic seat views so you can preview your vantage point before you buy. The price you see is the price you pay. You don't have to worry about hidden fees at checkout, right? It's just 2 taps and you have great seats locked in. It's fast, it's easy, and it's already done. Take the guesswork out of buying tickets by downloading Game Time app, create an account, and use code Locked On, and you'll get $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDON for $20 off. Download Game Time today. So free agency is just around the corner, and we're here for you here on the Locked On Podcast Network, especially if you are an everydayer of this podcast. You are the reason why Locked On is the #1 sports podcast network in the Western Hemisphere. And if you use the coupon code free agency, no spaces, you'll get a free month of the Everydayer Club, where you can be part of the ongoing offseason discussion about the Falcons and their various moves or lack of moves. You can get every episode of the show ad-free, and all you got to do is hit that link in the description below at lockedonfalcons.supercast.com to join the Everydayer Club. And again, use that code free agency with no spaces to get a free month. So when we talk about the top of the market, and as we have done the last several days on this podcast, I'm doing my best to make my best educated guesses on projecting some of these contracts. And for me, the top of the market is basically any contract that averages $12 million or more per year. And I'm expecting the top of the market for this year's free agent cornerback group to somewhere be in that $16 to $20 million range, right? That's based off of last year's moves. We all saw Paulson Adebo and Carlton Davis and Charvarius Ward all signed deals, I think, in that 18 million plus range. I would be surprised if anybody got 20 million, but you never know with free agency. But to me, the top 3 guys at the top of the market that I'm projecting biggest contracts, I have Alontae Taylor with an $18.5 million a year contract, Jaylen Watson with $17.5 million a year, and Reek Woolen with $17 million. And these are kind of to me, the gems of this free agent class. These are the guys that I think would be home run signings for the Falcons. If they wanted to spend a bunch of money, they could get these guys. Worth noting, Watson is from the state of Georgia, but I don't know if the Falcons want to do that, and do they want to have this much money invested in the cornerback position? Again, I think it's potentially worthwhile, but again, as I said earlier, I'm carrying a lot of baggage. I'm tired of seeing bad cornerback play opposite AJ Terrell, so I'm just like, spend some money. But AJ Terrell's making $20 million a year. Do you want to potentially get close to doubling that number just at the cornerback position? Maybe not. So we'll see if the Falcons are willing to get into a bidding war for at the very, very top of the market. Then next up, I have projected Jamel Dean just below $17 million a year. He might be the top guy, but I think his age, being a little bit older than some of these other guys, he's going to be 29 this year. And his injury history is basically averaged, or he's actually going to be 30 in October, but he's averaged missing like 3 games a year. But he, played some really good football this past year. But I think he's probably not going to have as robust a market just because, some of these other guys are still probably have, a couple of more years of their prime, where Dean might only have 1 or 2 years left, just typically because cornerbacks tend to slow down after the age of 30. But Nahshon Wright is the next name to know, projecting a $13 million a year average. Big guy, 6'4", coming off a Pro Bowl season, 5 interceptions this year. The concern with Nahshon Wright is there's a little bit of a buyer's beware, because until this year, you were seeing a career backup, barely played, I think, less than 300 career snaps across 4 years in the NFL, kind of bounced around the league before landing with the Bears this past year, had 1 interception across those 4 years, and then had 5 this year. And so you do wonder a little bit about if this is kind of fool's gold when it comes to Nahshon Wright. But obviously Ian Cunningham has an inside scoop on him. But if the Falcons signed any of these top of the market corners, he would probably be the one I'd be most skeptical about. Like, I understand, I get what the appeal is for Nahshon Wright, but I'd be a little skeptical whether or not he's going to fall back down to earth after a big 2025 season. Then you have Greg Newsome at $12 million a year. He has inside-outside versatility. Kevin Stefanski knows him from Cleveland. They traded him to the Jaguars midway through this past season in exchange for Tyson Campbell. He did had some durability concerns earlier in his year, but did play all 17 games last year, I believe, for the first time. Josh Jobe rounds out the sort of top of the market with another $12 million a year projection. The other guy in Seattle. There are other guys that I'm calling mid-tier, but I'm projecting them to have north of $10 million or more. So they could easily jump into that 12 million plus range. If my projections are way off, which they probably will be. I have Monteric Brown of Jacksonville, Kobe Durant of the Rams, Cordell Flott of the Giants, Eric Stokes of the Raiders. We'll talk a little bit about Stokes, even though we talked briefly about him with Jarvis Davis on the most recent episode. The things that Eric Stokes has going for him. He is a Georgia guy, so it's a homecoming. Maybe you get a hometown discount a little bit on that. He did play for Justin Hood, the Falcons DB's coach, for several years in Green Bay. The issues with Stokes are that he was constantly hurt during that time in Green Bay, but he has been a little healthier the last 2 years, his last year in Green Bay and then this past year with the Raiders, and arguably had his best year with the Raiders. So you may be getting the fully formed version of Eric Stokes after what we discussed yesterday with Jarvis, him being a former first round pick that didn't quite live up to the billing in Green Bay, but now maybe is ready to do that. Now, other guys worth noting in that mid-tier, Trevon Diggs. He's been injured a lot the last 3 years. You potentially sign him to a 1-year prove-it deal. And then you wonder if he can get back those ball skills that made him one of the top cornerbacks in the league to start out his career. I know a lot of the guys that we've been talking about so far are not guys that are known for their ball production, getting a lot of interceptions. And I know a lot of you, the big knock on AJ is he doesn't get a lot of interceptions. And I know a lot of you guys probably want a cornerback too that is more prone to creating some of those turnovers. And so Diggs was definitely that before those injuries. The question is, can he get back to that, right? Martin Emerson's another guy familiar with Kevin Stefanski from the days in Cleveland. He missed his past year with an Achilles injury. We already have Billy Bowman coming off that same injury. Not sure you want to bring a second guy in the building that's recovering from that injury, but certainly a guy worth noting. And then we get into the potential cap cuts, right? We mentioned Marshon Lattimore earlier. Marlon Humphrey is probably the biggest name out of this bunch with the Ravens. The value of Humphrey is that inside-outside versatility. Now, as he's 30, I've seen some people suggest that maybe he's at the point where he should transition full-time to a nickel. We'll see if he gets cut. I know he's got like a $26 million cap hit, but Jesse Minter, obviously was rehired as the new head coach in Baltimore. He was the position coach back in like 2019, 2020. So maybe he still has an affinity for Marlon Humphrey. Maybe he thinks Humphrey is lost a step or whatever, and they're going to move on. So we'll see. But, since we're talking about a guy like Humphrey potentially helping out the team on the interior as an inside nickel guy, that's going to get us to where we want to wrap up today's episode, talking about some of those other nickel options that the Falcons could explore in free agency besides simply bringing back Dee Alford. And we'll talk about Dee Alford's potential contract as we wrap up today's Locked On Falcons. It's tax time, but for a lot of us, the old way of doing taxes is a lot. Trying to book an appointment that's not the most convenient, sitting in a waiting room with a stack of papers, emailing back and forth, and wondering if they really get your situation. But this year, you're getting a major upgrade with Intuit TurboTax now has in-person locations nationwide. You can meet face-to-face with a real tax expert, and your documents get uploaded straight to your TurboTax app on the spot. And just like that, you're done. Your TurboTax expert works to get you every dollar you deserve while you get real-time notifications as you go about your day. It's the relief of walking in and meeting a real person and walking out knowing your taxes are being handled right. Head to turbotax.com/local to find a store near you and book your appointment today. So I've only projected 3 nickels here. Roger McCreary, $12 million a year. That's exactly what Nate Hobbs got last year from the Packers. Dee Alford, projecting him to sign a 2-year, $8 million deal, so averaging about $4 million a year. And then Kader Kohu with the Dolphins, a 1-year, $3 million deal, mostly because he missed all of last year with an ACL tear. And obviously that depreciates your value, and you got to go out there and sign a 1-year prove-it deal more often than not. Now, we did an episode about 2 weeks ago on pass or pay on Dee Alford, where we basically made the case for and against keeping Dee Alford. And I noted in that episode that I don't think retaining Dee Alford is going to be too expensive. I also noted in that episode I think it's worthwhile for a team like the Falcons in particular to sign him to a 2-year deal because it gives you some insurance heading into 2027 where you don't quite know what you're going to get with Billy Bowman. We're expecting him to be healthier coming off that Achilles in year 2. But At the same time, there's a world where we might be asking Billy Bowman to make the move to safety in 2027, potentially, as opposed to staying at that nickel cornerback spot. And sort of, you want to make sure you have whoever you wind up signing this offseason to man that nickel. If you do decide to do that, whether it's Dee Alford or somebody else, to me, it makes a lot of sense to lock that guy into 2 years just to have that insurance in your back pocket. Now, Bowman is going to play this year coming off the Achilles, but as we well know, with guys like Kirk Cousins and so many others, that injury has a negative impact on you on the first year back, and you really aren't back to your previous form until the second year back, right? Now, I think Alford, as we've mentioned before, is a solid stopgap for this team, despite what Jarvis Davis will sort of imply to you guys. I don't hate Dee Alford. Right? I just basically refuse to get stuck on an island defending Dee Alford in the year of our Lord 2025. I'm already stuck on Caleb McGarry Island. I'm not trying to start a whole archipelago. And if I was going to start an archipelago, fighting for my life, defending various unpopular Falcon players, Dee Alford would not be at the top of that list, and whatnot. But, I do think, as we've mentioned before, the Falcons could do better at the nickel cornerback spot than Dee Alford. I don't know if they need to get into the Roger McCreary market, if it should go like that, even though I'm a big fan of McCreary's game. I think really you're kind of hoping to see some of these veterans get cut, and I'll be curious if the Falcons pursue some of these guys. We already mentioned Humphrey. Michael Carter is another guy that is potentially going to get cut by the Eagles. He was a huge part of that Jets defense, as we mentioned earlier, serving as that nickel alongside DJ Reed and Sauce Gardner. In a lot of ways, I think a big reason why Jeff Ulbrich had a great affinity for Billy Bowman when he was coming out was basically because he saw him very similarly to Michael Carter. Now, we can argue and debate, who's the better prospect. I'm sure if you're a regular listener of this podcast, probably where I'm going to go. Why get a poor man's Michael Carter and Billy Bowman, or a middle-class man's, probably more accurate, Michael Carter and Billy Bowman, when you can get the full thing in Michael Carter. So that may be worthwhile for the Falcons if he is cut by the Eagles. Nate Hobbs is another player that got a lucrative contract from the Packers. He did play for the new Falcons assistant DBs coach, Ricky Manny, when he was an assistant with the Raiders back in 2024, where he was primarily a nickel guy. The Packers did sign him to be an outside corner last year. He did not perform well from what I have understood. But once he moved back to the nickel spot later in the season, did start to look like a worthwhile investment or whatever. And it seems like he's more comfortable playing nickel than he is as an outside corner. So we'll see if he gets cut, but he could be an option there as well. Teron Johnson, who's a little bit older, being age 30, he just got cut by the Bills on Friday. L'Jarius Sneed is expected to be cut by the Titans. He's not been very good these last 2 years after they made the move to get him from Kansas City. He was very good in Kansas City, as we well know. Similar to Marlon Humphrey, has that inside-outside versatility. Could be a decent reclamation project if you can get him for considerably cheaper than what the Titans had to give up for him. So I think the Falcons absolutely have options at that nickel cornerback position, right? They can choose to bring back Dee Alford. They can sign somebody, particularly some of these guys that are potential cap cuts. Of course, they still have Mike Hughes in the building. He's counting $5.5 million against this year's salary cap. $3.5 million of that is guaranteed, which makes it very hard for the Falcons to cut him, other than with a post-June 1 cut. And I think they only saved like $500,000 against the salary cap. So it's not really worth it, because you're going to be basically like eating $5 million in dead money, either for Mike Hughes to play for you or not to play for you. You might as well get something out of him. And we know Mike Hughes is a much better outside corner than he is a nickel corner. But if you don't feel comfortable having, a $5 million backup on your roster, riding the bench, you can throw him into the mix at that nickel cornerback spot, particularly if you let Dee Alford walk, right? He can just kind of be a placeholder until you find a better option, potentially in the draft or whatever. You also have, other internal options like Natron Brooks, Kobe Bryant. I've always thought Kobe Bryant projected better as a nickel than he did as an outside corner. Clark Phillips. Yes, I'm still pushing the Clark Phillips. His only chance to salvage his NFL career is making a successful transition as a nickel cornerback, all that stuff. And so with Bowman's injury, I think you definitely need another option there, right? It's a similar situation, I think, to when Isaiah Oliver came back from his knee injury back in 2022, where he was basically splitting reps with Dee Alford during that season at the nickel cornerback position. And, we don't expect Bowman to be 100% coming off the Achilles. And so I think you just at the very least need somebody that can share the load as you work Bowman back at the very least, right? Now, ideally, I think you can go out there and get someone that doesn't need to share the load, and so that you can work Bowman back at, whatever pace you need to work him back and implement some dime looks and whatnot with 6 DBs on the field as opposed to the nickel stuff. But that also gives you the option to move Bowman to safety as well. If you solidify that nickel spot and like, okay, this is our nickel, and Bowman, we can potentially move him to safety, especially in 2027, get a jump start on what could be a permanent move in 2027 when Jesse Bates is a free agent and whatnot. So we'll see on that front. But I think overall, cornerback is a position that I think it makes sense for the Falcons to be aggressive on in this at least initial wave of free agency. Again, I don't necessarily need to see 12:05 p.m. Eastern time Monday Falcons make this big splash. But I do think with most other spots across this roster, I'd be comfortable with the Falcons kind of sitting out the first wave of free agency when teams are throwing around the big money and whatnot. But if we get to, I'm not saying they got to do it on Monday, but like we get to like Thursday and Friday and we haven't made a move at cornerback, I'm going to be like, what's going on? But, I think cornerback is the one spot. It's worth it, not just to dip your toe in, right? It's like, let's get both feet in the pool, right? We don't have to go in the deep end, right? And if you're following the analogy, but, Ian, let's get wet. You know what I'm saying? So I think they have many options at the cornerback position. I just narrowed it down for those of you that are watching on YouTube. You saw the graphics to like 27 guys, right? But I started off with like a list of like 60 guys and narrowed it down. So there's twice as many guys as we discussed on today's episode that potentially options for the Falcons at the cornerback position. So I'm curious, are there any names that I left off that we didn't get to today that you think are worthwhile targets for the Falcons? By all means, leave a comment. Tell me what your plans would be. Would you spend? Would you draft? Is cornerback the position that you would spend big money on, or is there another position? So, yeah, always welcome your feedback. You can leave a comment here. Hit me up on the email, lockdownfalcons@mail.com, Locked On Falcons Discord, the Locked On Podcast Network Discord, as well as, the Insider program for the Locked On Falcons Insiders. You can find the links to all that stuff in the description below. And of course, we still have a couple more positions that we want to sort of do a breakdown of, and edge and D-line are one of them. I do want to have a conversation about tight end, even though I don't know if we're going to do a full tight end free agent breakdown, but I do want to talk a little bit about, Charlie Warner, potential to get cut, Jonnu Smith's, potential fit in this offense and the style of tight end that really has historically excelled in the Kevin Stefanski offense. So that will be in store for you guys over the weekend. So continue to make Locked On Falcons your first listen on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. Check out Locked On NFL, Locked On NFL Draft to get all the scoop on going around the rest of the league as well as the upcoming draft. And of course, if you never miss an episode, the Everyday Club is built for you. Get Locked On Falcons ad-free, members-only Discord access, and so much more. Head to the link in the description below at lockedonfalcons.supercast.com to find out more. And if you use the coupon code free agency, no spaces, you will get the first month of the Everyday Club free. So $5 off and, 1/12 of $50. So I think it's like $4 and something off. We did the math at some point. So go check it out in the link in the description below. That's going to do it for us here, guys. It's all part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.